Hi, friends. I'm Kathryn Korostoff, and I'd like to welcome you to a new conversation for Research Rockstars. Today, I'm going to have a special guest to talk about a special topic, using market research to fuel thought leadership programs. Now, I know some of our listeners work at market research agencies. Some of you work on insights teams within big brands. In either case, you probably do research on a wide variety of topics, maybe product concept testing or message testing or market segmentation, ad testing, and so on. But you also might, from time to time, have the opportunity to do thought leadership research. It's a little bit different than the other types of research we do, and that's why I wanted to bring in a special expert to talk about this topic. So with this, I'd like to welcome our guest, Lilah Raynor. Lilah is the CEO of Logica Research. Logica Research serves a wide variety of clients, including many Fortune 500 companies. And what's really fun is that some of the research that these companies have done with Lilah's company have then been published in leading media outlets like the New York Times, CNN, the Financial Times, and more. With that, I'm going to introduce Lilah. Thanks for joining us today. So thank you for bringing your expertise to us today, Lilah. It's great to have you here. And I'll let you start to share your knowledge about using market research for thought leadership.
Yeah, absolutely, Kathryn. And thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about this. It's one of my favorite topics. So first of all, we think about kind of old school, if you remember some of sort of game shows that came up and you would hear, survey says, and that's part of what thought leadership research is. So one of the things to think about, if you have a client coming to you and saying they want to do PR or thought leadership research, those can be one and the same things. But one of the big things to talk about is the why. Why are you doing thought leadership research? So this is where it's like any other study, in that you really want to understand and clarify the objectives that you have. And we're going to talk about that, as along with the when, the who, the where, the how. So all these key questions that, if any of you listening to this can remember from your days of writing a research report or writing an essay or even an article, if you ever wrote something for the news, these are the key questions that you want to ask yourself. These are the key questions that we ask ourselves in research in general, and they're really important for thought leadership and PR research. So first of all, the why. It's super important that you define your objectives clearly. So they're going to be different than your typical research study. So if you're doing a research study for a client or internally and it's informing a business strategy decision, maybe you're message testing, you're doing brand tracking or product development research, the way that you set up the sample design is going to be different, or the ways that you ask questions. Here, the why is more about, what do you want to support? Are you supporting the brand reputation publicly? Are you wanting to support a product or acquisition? And specifically working with your stakeholders and clients to understand, are you trying to generate media buzz? Are you trying to create findings that can be used in social media content? So maybe you're not looking for mass media publications, but really the way that this is going to be used is in social media content. Maybe it's in marketing content. Maybe it's in sales enablement tools, even to the point like on the B2B side of a business where you have salespeople including findings from this research in their pitch decks. Maybe it's an executive that's going to be using results at an industry conference. And then the sort of broad umbrella of thought leadership research, everything that's on this page here sort of falls into that category. Historically, or maybe, traditionally, you might think of a white paper as being a thought leadership study, but it really can be used in all these different ways. And so understanding from your internal stakeholders what's most important here. So once you really hone in on the why, you're going to be addressing some of these other questions. And one of the reasons I love PR and thought leadership research is it is an opportunity to have some more fun and be a bit more playful potentially than maybe some of the other business strategy research studies that we do. And that's one of the things that you're going to identify when you're talking to your stakeholders about the why, is also what is the tone that you want to have with the research? Is it serious? Is it more academic? Or is it going to be more playful and fun? Are you trying to get coverage in Cosmo, or are you trying to get coverage in investment news? And how you ask questions and when you do it, and all these other aspects of the research design come into play in terms of where you think you're going to try to get coverage, if it's for the media, or again, how you're going to use the results. So one of those key questions is when. So the image here is for a specific conference. So we did a study for Orion. They used it at a conference, and they also had a press release. But you can see that was a very specific focus, and the timing of the study and how we did it was all driven by the fact that the results were going to be used at this conference. Again, it might be much broader than that. Or we've done research that was used by PayPal for Friendship Day, very specific use, where key findings were put in cute cards that you could send to a friend on Friendship Day. So you can imagine a lot of different uses. And again, from playful to, very serious or more academic kind of research. If you're doing something that's for social impact or social causes, you're probably going to be more serious. If it's B2B, it's going to be more serious. And that timing of when that coverage or that press release that you want is going to drive the timing for the study, and also is probably going to drive what you can do, because we all know we have stakeholders that come to us and we want to do a study for Women's History Month. Well, Women's History Month is it's behind us, but if it's in a couple of weeks, what you can do to get some findings in that short period of time is going to be different than if they're coming to you now for next year and you want to get some findings for Women's History Month. So you might be able to do a couple of questions in a quick term omnibus study if it's for something that's in a couple of weeks, versus laying out a much more robust and bigger sample plan and timing if it's down the road. So again, it comes back to how do you want to use those results. I have some other examples in here as well that kind of get to the when we talk about some of these other questions. So another part of the why and understanding the objectives is also about the who. So who's the audience you want to reach? So I said, are you trying to reach the audience who reads Cosmo, or are you trying to reach the audience that is reading investment news, or who's maybe at the World Economic Forum in Davos? And depending on who the audience is that you want to reach and actually read your results or see your results is going to impact your sample design. So we look at those two things together: is who do you want to communicate to, and then you think about who your sample frame is going to be. Yeah, Kathryn, you're on.
Thanks, Lilah. It's an interesting way that you talk about the audience and about thinking about, are we trying to get in front of the people who read Cosmo or the people who read the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal? So is the assumption that when I'm planning a thought leadership study that I should think that specifically about where the news releases might be getting covered or I want them getting covered? I would think that there could also be cases where it's more of a thought leadership where the distribution of the content might be more direct from the company to end customers. I'm just curious what the mix is there in terms of, is it generally best practice to really think specifically about actual publication sources, or are there cases where it's really an internal direct distribution?
Yeah, the answer to that is a yes. And so both of those things are important. So one of the things that we do when we're meeting with a client about a potential study is we do ask these questions. What is the tone that you want to strike? who is it that you are going to be sharing these results with? Is it going in the media? Is it mass media? Is it business media or more consumer media? Or is it going to be used more, on the B2B side or internally, where you want a white paper, you want something that you can send by email in a link. Maybe you want to use it on your social media channel, but it might not be getting media coverage at all. And so working through those questions with your clients and stakeholder and really getting them to think about it. They don't always know when they're coming to you. And so part of our job is to help them understand that depending on where they want to get coverage or how they want to use the results will impact the research design, budget, timing, the way that we ask questions, which we'll get to, and all those things. Yeah. So absolutely, you could do a thought leadership study that becomes a white paper that is distributed as a PDF, in a link in an email, and that's gonna influence how you think about the design. So that's the end, and in terms of who you want to reach. And one of the big things about doing PR and thought leadership research is you actually do think about the end first and work your way backwards, more so than your regular marketing research or business strategy research, where you do want to think about, what's the analysis plan? How are we going to use the results? You do think about those aspects of the end. But with PR and thought leadership research, those end outcomes you're thinking about are a little bit different. It's who's going to be seeing this, how is it going to be used, what's the message you want to convey, or the things that you want to communicate at the end, and work back your design and the questions that you ask based on the answers to those ending questions. So the who comes into play in two ways. It's who do you want to reach, and then that's going to drive your sample frame in terms of, are you going to get feedback from customers or prospects? Are they going to be consumers or business people? Are they going to be women who are business owners, for example? We did a study, this is public, we did a study for Visa that was among women small business owners, and that was used nationally and in local markets. And that has a very different purpose than, say, another study that we did for PayPal and the future of work that was used at the World Economic Forum, where there was a white paper and there were speaking points as well. And the audience for one was women small business owners. The other audience for the other was workers in 8 different countries, a survey of 8,000 different people. And so we thought about that sample design and who we were going to talk to based on what we wanted to talk about at the end. And you can imagine different situations. We have specific markets, for example. We do national studies, and we do studies that are also used in specific cities so that our clients can get local press. We do international studies, and then those are used in specific countries and so on. So I mentioned, the study we did for PayPal that was used for the World Economic Forum. And we do a study for Charles Schwab, also public, the Modern Wealth Study that is now in its 7th year. And that is a national study in 13 different cities. And so you can think about very localized and then global as well. And again, it really depends about how you want to use it. Imagine a scenario where you're really trying to help support brand awareness in a specific local market. And so doing something where you can have some results to talk about, again, this idea of, like, the survey says 80% of people, in Dallas drink coffee with milk and sugar, or whatever that is, and being able to talk about that and highlight that in a very specific way to bring attention to your brand or your product in that market. And then, of course, there are other reasons you do thought leadership studies, which, again, I'm using the word serious, but might be more academic, where you're talking about a specific cause or an issue, or, a medical or health related issue that's not as consumer oriented. So I do want to talk about the how, because this really is an opportunity to be more creative and thoughtful and fun and playful than maybe some of the other surveys that you work on. So one of the things that I find funny, we've talked to different clients over the years, and if you're really looking for something that's trying to get PR in, say, a consumer space, I've had people say, okay, we want questions that are either about the bathroom or the bedroom, because those get headlines. And when you're working in a more B2B or business space, you're not going to do those. You're not going to have those kinds of questions. But it is true. Again, I'm picking on the magazine Cosmo a little bit, because historically they've published these kind of fun facts and stuff. But you do want to think about that. And even if you have, let's say you're doing research that's going to be used for business purposes, one of the things I will say, regardless of kind of who your audience is, you really want to keep things simple in how you ask questions. So I would say in general in the research industry, it seems like we're moving away from longer scales and things like that. But for PR and thought leadership research, you're not going to use a lot of scales. And if you do use scales, you're going to keep them to 3 or 4 points. What you want to do is have questions that have really simple and clear response choices, so that when you're reporting out on them publicly, they're very easy to understand. And if your client is talking to reporters and the reporters have questions, it's going to be really easy for your client to explain the data, and it's going to be really easy for the reporter to interpret the data. So again, thinking about working backwards from the end result, one of the things that we do is go beyond, what are your hypotheses about what you're going to learn, but actually, what are the headlines that you want to have at the end of this study? What is it that you want to shout out in your press release? And then work backwards from those headlines to develop the questions. So often we'll have questions that have just 2 response choices. And for example, is health or wealth more important to you? And making people pick between those 2 options, not giving others, not giving none, not giving both, but really forcing people to pick one or the other to create tension in your responses that are going to be more interesting from a media perspective. The other thing that we do, and is on this slide, and I mentioned it a couple of times, is just as you think about your sample, you also want to keep that pretty simple. If you're doing a general population study, that's pretty clear. What's getting media coverage is generational differences. So making sure that you have the ability to talk about generations, especially the youngest generations. We do a lot of research right now where we're talking about Gen Z, because that gets media coverage. And you want to, again, keep it simple enough and clear enough that sort of the average person who doesn't know about research can read the results and really understand them and describe them in a way that is not going to be overly complicated. So, Kathryn, I'm going to pause there for a second and see if you had any questions you think your audience might have about this.
I don't know that it's so much a question, but I really thought that one of the points you made that was so interesting is about keeping the scales simple. Because as market researchers, we are often using for rating scales, we do typically use 5, 7, or in some cases 11-point scales. So the idea of using, intentionally smaller scales is a really interesting suggestion I wouldn't have thought of, but I totally get the point that you need to make sure that people can understand the data, and that people who aren't market researchers can help others understand the data too. Of course, there could be scenarios where perhaps the researcher does use a 5 or 7 point scale, but they consolidate the scale for the purpose of reporting, right?
Yes, yeah, all those things are true. And originally come from a more academic background, and having a midpoint on a scale so important. And I had to almost be taken kicking and screaming, away from using that kind of scale. But what happens if you use a midpoint in this kind of research, and again, I'm thinking more broadly for PR and thought leadership research. There may be thought leadership research where it's important, is that if you give people a midpoint or a neutral option, and a lot of the answers could fall into that space, and then it's not that interesting to talk about. There might be research reasons that's really interesting, but it's not going to be interesting from a media perspective.
Got it. So even with the idea of consolidating a scale, it could be risky to even start with a scale with a midpoint. Interesting.
Yeah. So let's say you have a 5-point agree, disagree scale, and then everybody falls in the middle, and you get, 20% of people saying they agree with something. If you get rid of that middle point and kind of push people to the extremes, you're getting 60% of people who say they agree versus 40% who say they disagree. And I totally get, from a researcher, kind of pure researcher, that might make people's heads explode. Like, what? Why would we do that? People are in the middle. That's a valid response. That's all true. But when you're trying to create tension, you are kind of giving that forced choice. And, it's like, for any parents kind of listening, if you give your children, you can have milk or water, right? Soda is not on the menu, and it's a forced choice. And you kind of use some of that tactic in this kind of research, as well as just like that idea of asking what I call on the nose or straight ahead questions. Not trying to be too clever or tricky with the questions, but what is it that you want to know, being really simple and clear. And then you have maybe some more detailed questions that get support. One thing I also want to mention is that I would say there is a temptation in this kind of research to want to do tracking over time, and that can be useful for some questions. But if there are things that don't change that much over time, they're not going to be as interesting from a media perspective. So you want to try to have new questions that you're rotating in that are more timely, that are going to get media attention. And this is true for all research, but it's definitely true for thought leadership and PR research, is the plan ahead piece. You can always turn something around quickly, but of course, now I'm a planner, so I'm saying this, but the more you plan ahead, the more you're going to be able to think through those things about sample design and timing and developing the questions. It also is true that because these surveys are a bit different, and I would say often your clients, your internal stakeholders, they like working on these surveys too. So you want to allow time for that input and that feedback, and engaging them so that they're along and for the process and have input on the questions, and often they want to. So building that time in. These questionnaires are creative and fun, and at the same time, because it's not a set framework, it allow extra time for that creative processing and revisions and iterations.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I do have one more question, and that's about the importance of how we document methodology for these types of studies. One of the things that has always been a challenge for those of us who are market researchers is the idea of the magic number in terms of sample size. So I can know a lot about the target population I'm doing research with. I may very much have past data that gives me some idea about the variability that I'm likely to see in their self-reported attitudes and behaviors. And maybe I determine that my sample size statistically would be fine at, say, 450 and in many cases. But do I need a magic number? Do I have to go to 1,000, even though technically it's really not going to add any value to the data? But for thought leadership, is it important to hit those magic numbers?
Yeah, really good question. And I am smiling because I originally worked with a gentleman named John Gilfeather on some of the slides for this. And I referred to him as a guru of thought leadership and PR research. And he would say that, sample size in general, you want to, for the optics of it, for the news, the magic number is 1,000. And you even see some press releases that they'll have 1,005, or something like that. But at the same time, if you're doing niche sample, say in the B2B space, you can get coverage with a much smaller sample size. And John would say that, if you want to survey God, you only need a sample size of 1, right? So if you're really looking for, executives in a specific, who are in the fintech space, for example, in the United States, maybe a sample size of 50 or 100 is enough to do what you need to do for a thought leadership study. But you need to have those conversations with your client also. You may not get, again, it comes back to how you're going to use it. You're probably not going to get mass media coverage for that. But in the New York Times, for example, it's hard to get coverage with a sample size smaller than 1,000. Some of these things are changing, but that's, historically been the magic number. But while you bring that up, the other thing that you will see in the description of the methodology is a reference to margin of error. And it used to be that, you would do random samples and you could actually report that margin of error. You'll see it still, but more often you'll see, this is an online panel, margin of error doesn't apply. If this had been a random sample, the margin of error would be 3% or whatever it is. But kind of moving away from that reporting of margin of error because it's not really applicable anymore. So you see that as well. But short answer to your question is the magic number is 1,000. And then you do see press coverage of, sometimes having really large sample sizes will help with press coverage depending on what it is.
Excellent. Well, perception is reality, right? If people perceive the magic number as the number at which research is reliable and credible, fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I think more now it's about, especially if it's general population, being able to talk about differences in generation and those things where you want to look at subgroups are really important.
Excellent. Great. Well, Lilah, thank you so much for joining me here today. I know I've learned a lot. I took a whole page of notes. So thank you so much for that. And I hope to get a chance to chat with you again in the future.
Thanks so much, Kathryn. This has been fun. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining me for today's conversation on using market research to fuel thought leadership programs. And as a reminder, these shows are available as both a video podcast and an audio podcast. If you found it useful, please do give us a like or subscribe. That's even better. Thanks.